Genesis 6:4. This short verse in the Bible has caused more debate, more speculation, and more academic confusion than almost any other verse in the entire book. 4 words. That's it. The Nephilim were on the earth. That is almost everything the book of Genesis tells you about them. They were here before the flood. They were born from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. They were powerful. They were famous. Then the great flood comes, and they are wiped out. But are they really wiped out? Because something very strange happens. Centuries after the flood, in the 13th chapter of the book of Numbers, the same name shows up again. Moses sends out 12 scouts to explore the land of Canaan. And when those scouts come back, they come back in a panic. They say, "We saw the Nephilim there. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And we looked like grasshoppers in their eyes too." Same name, same word, different time, different place. And all of this, centuries after the great flood that was supposed to have erased them. When you stop and think about it logically, something doesn't add up here, does it? If these beings were destroyed in the flood, what are they doing in the book of Numbers? Or were they never destroyed at all? Who were they? What do the earliest physical pieces of evidence tell us? What does the ground itself say about these beings? The ones Genesis describes as the offspring of the divine and the human. Now look, if you search for this topic on YouTube, you'll come across hundreds of channels. Most of them will talk about giants. They'll show you a few striking images, they'll read you 2 or 3 verses, and they'll leave you with far more questions than answers. We're going to do something different. We're going to go to the oldest texts that describe these beings in real detail. Texts found in the same caves as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Texts copied by the same hands. Texts considered sacred by the same community, but later left out of the Bible. And we're going to ask what the physical evidence and the written evidence really say. Before we go anywhere else, we need to read what the Bible actually says, not what popular culture has turned it into. Genesis 6:1-4 is one of the most compressed and mysterious passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. It reads, in full, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, 'My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 4 observations that are often missed. First, the text does not say the Nephilim were giants. Not in this passage. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall. The most literal translation is the fallen ones, or possibly those who cause others to fall, meaning warriors who make others fall in battle. The traditional translation as giants comes largely from the Greek Septuagint, which translated Nephilim as gigantes, a word that in Greek originally meant earthborn, but was later understood as giant. The conflation of Nephilim with giants is ancient, but it is a translation choice, not an inherent meaning of the Hebrew word. Second, the phrase sons of God, Hebrew Bene Elohim, appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible specifically to refer to heavenly beings, members of the divine council. In Job 1 and Job 2, the Bene Elohim present themselves before God. In Psalm 82, God stands in the divine council and condemns the Elohim for corrupt judgment. In Deuteronomy 32:8, in the Dead Sea Scrolls version of the text, the nations of the earth are divided according to the number of the sons of God, a cosmic apportionment of divine authority over human nations. The Bene Elohim are not humans. They are beings from the divine realm. Third, the text says explicitly, "and also afterward," meaning the Nephilim existed before the flood and after it. This is not an interpolation or a scribal error. It is in the text. It explains the Numbers 13 passage, which otherwise would be incomprehensible. The Nephilim survived the flood, or something that shared their nature appeared again after it. The text itself creates this problem. Any interpretation of the Nephilim has to account for it. Fourth, the narrative of Genesis 6:1-4 immediately precedes the flood narrative. The text connects the two. The wickedness that provokes God to send the flood is described immediately after the description of the divine-human unions and the Nephilim. The implication, made explicit in later texts, is that the corruption of the Nephilim and their offspring was a significant cause of the flood judgment. These 4 points, the uncertain translation of Nephilim, the divine nature of the sons of God, the post-flood reappearance, and the connection to the flood's cause, are the framework that every serious interpretation of this passage has to engage with. And the most detailed ancient engagement with all 4 is not found in the Bible. It is found in the Book of Enoch. We have discussed the Book of Enoch before on this channel, in our documentary on the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we noted that 11 copies of one Enoch were found at Qumran, more than almost any other non-biblical text, and that the Epistle of Jude quotes it directly in the New Testament. But we did not go through what it actually says about the Nephilim. That is what we are going to do now. The Book of Enoch, specifically the section called the Book of the Watchers, which scholars date to the 3rd century BCE and which represents the oldest stratum of the Enoch tradition, provides the most detailed ancient account of Genesis 6:1-4 in existence. According to 1 Enoch, the sons of God were a specific group of angels called the Watchers, beings assigned to observe and guard humanity. 200 of them descended to earth on Mount Hermon, a specific, real mountain on the border of modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. They swore an oath together. They knew they were violating a boundary. They did it anyway. Their leader is named Shemi-Hazah. His second in command is Azazel. The text gives the names of all 200. These are not vague mythological figures. They are presented as specific beings making a specific decision with specific consequences. The Watchers took human women as wives. Their offspring were giants. The text of 1 Enoch uses the term Gibberim, heroes, and specifically describes them as enormous in stature, consuming the food of ordinary humans, and then, when that ran out, consuming the humans themselves. The Watchers also taught their wives forbidden knowledge, the art of metalworking for weapons, cosmetic arts, sorcery, astrology, the cutting of roots for medicine and poison, and the interpretation of omens. This is the origin myth of the problem. Not just sexual violation of a cosmic boundary, but the introduction of knowledge that humanity was not supposed to have. Knowledge that disrupted the natural order and accelerated the corruption that made the flood necessary. God's response. 4 archangels are dispatched. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel receive specific assignments. Raphael is sent to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness of the desert, specifically a desert called Dudael, which some scholars have connected to the wilderness area east of Jerusalem. He is to be covered with rough and jagged rocks and left there until the day of judgment. Shemi-Hazah and the other Watchers are bound in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations. Their giant offspring are to be killed in the conflict that breaks out among them. And indeed, the text describes the giants turning on each other in a catastrophic internal war. But the giants die without their spirits being released through a natural human death. And this is the origin of demons, according to 1 Enoch. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the spirits of the giants who died in the flood, now wandering the earth, bodiless, seeking hosts, causing illness and spiritual corruption. They are not angels. They are not humans. They are a new category of being, hybrid, anomalous, neither fully of heaven nor fully of earth. And their existence persists after the flood because their spirits were never bound the way their angelic fathers were. This is the Enochic explanation for why the Nephilim appear after the flood in Numbers 13. The physical giants who appear in Canaan after the flood are not the original pre-flood Nephilim. They are a new generation, the result of the demonic spirits of the original Nephilim continuing to influence human reproduction, or the result of the Watcher's sin recurring in a new generation. The text is not entirely clear on the mechanism, but the theological framework is consistent. The boundary violation of Genesis 6 has ongoing consequences that the flood did not fully resolve. The post-flood giants of Canaan are not a single event in the biblical text. They form a persistent thread that runs from Numbers through Deuteronomy, through Joshua, through Samuel. And the archaeological context of that thread is more interesting than most readers realize. Numbers 13 is where the problem first reappears after the flood. Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan to survey the land before the Israelite invasion. They are gone 40 days. When they return, 10 of the 12 are terrified. Their report, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The descendants of Enoch, the Anakim, are specifically identified as Nephilim descendants. They live in Hebron and the hill country of southern Canaan. Their size is so extreme that experienced scouts, hardened men who have survived the wilderness, describe themselves as grasshoppers by comparison. This is not rhetorical exaggeration in the narrative. It is the report that triggers the crisis of faith that condemns an entire generation to die in the wilderness. The credibility of the account depends on its factual precision. Deuteronomy expands the picture significantly. Moses, addressing the Israelites before they enter Canaan, recounts the territory east of the Jordan occupied by the Rephaim, another giant people group with a distinct name and territory. Their most famous king was Og of Bashan, described in Deuteronomy 3:11 in terms that the text clearly treats as verifiable. His bed was made of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? It is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubit. 9 cubits by 4 cubits, approximately 13.5 feet by 6 feet using standard ancient measurements. The author of Deuteronomy knows exactly where this bed is and explicitly invites the reader to go verify it. This is not the language of mythology. It is the language of evidence. The giants of Canaan are not a single ethnic group. They appear under multiple distinct names across multiple biblical texts: Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim. Each group occupies a specific territory. Deuteronomy 2 provides a careful geographical survey. The Emim were formerly in Moab. The Zamzumim were in Ammon. The Anakim were in the hill country of Canaan. The Rephaim were in Bashan. Each name corresponds to a different regional tradition. Each has its own history of displacement or survival. This is the pattern of careful ethnographic record-keeping, not of myth-making. The Anakim are systematically eliminated by Joshua in the Canaan campaign. Caleb, the one spy who, alongside Joshua, gave a minority report of faith in Numbers 13, specifically requests Hebron as his inheritance precisely because it is the Anakim stronghold. He is 85 years old when he makes this request, and he drives the Anakim out. But the text is careful to note that complete elimination is not achieved. No Anakim were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive, 3 cities, all on the Philistine coastal plain. This is the critical geographical detail. Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, the surviving refuge of the Anakim, are the heart of Philistine territory. And from these cities, 1 to 2 generations later, the giant warriors who faced David and his men emerge. Goliath comes from Gath. 1 Samuel 17 describes him as 6 cubits and a span tall, approximately 9.5 feet by standard ancient measurement, though some textual traditions give a lower figure of 4 cubits and a span. He is armored in bronze from head to foot, carries a spear with an iron point weighing 600 shekels, and is described as a champion, a representative warrior sent out to settle the battle by single combat. He taunts the Israelite army for 40 days before David accepts the challenge. But Goliath is not the last. 2 Samuel 21:15-22 records a series of 4 separate battles between David's warriors and giant fighters, all described as descendants of the Rapha, the Rephaim, all from Gath. The passage ends. These 4 were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. 4 giants, 1 family line, 1 city. And the connection runs directly back through Gath to the Anakim who fled there from Hebron, who themselves traced their lineage back to the Nephilim. The biblical thread is consistent and geographically precise. Whatever these beings were, They were documented with the specificity of historical record. At this point, we need to be precise about what archaeology can and cannot tell us about the Nephilim and the giants of Canaan. Matters here more than almost anywhere else in biblical archaeology, because the popular content surrounding this topic is unusually saturated with fabrication. There is an enormous amount of popular content online claiming that archaeology has found giant skeletons across the Middle East. Skeletons of 8-foot, 10-foot, 12-foot humans supposedly discovered and then suppressed by the Smithsonian Institution or other academic bodies. These claims are not supported by any peer-reviewed archaeological literature. The photographs that circulate with these claims have been consistently traced to digital image manipulations, photographic hoaxes, or misidentified materials from unrelated contexts. No giant human skeleton has ever been recovered from a Bronze Age or Iron Age context in the Levant or anywhere else in the world. And no credible evidence of institutional suppression of such finds has ever been produced. This is the honest answer. It needs to be said clearly. The Nephilim tradition is ancient, textually rich, and genuinely significant. It does not need fabricated evidence. And the fabricated evidence actually undermines the serious case for taking the biblical tradition seriously. What archaeology does show is more nuanced and more genuinely interesting. The specific locations associated with giant populations in the biblical text have been extensively excavated. Hebron, the stronghold of the Anakim, sits at Tel Rumeida in the modern city of Hebron. Excavations conducted by Philip Hammond and later by Avi Ofer have confirmed continuous occupation from the early Bronze Age through the Iron Age, with a substantial late Bronze Age city exact contemporary with the conquest narrative. The site shows evidence of a significant urban center with strong fortifications. This is precisely the kind of city that would require significant military capability to take, consistent with the biblical description of Hebron as a major Anakim stronghold. Bashan, the territory of Og and the Rephaim, is modern-day Hauran in southern Syria and the Golan Heights. The archaeological landscape of Bashan is dominated by something that most visitors to the region immediately notice: dolmens. These are massive stone burial structures, upright stones supporting a flat capstone, creating a chamber that dot the landscape of the Golan and Transjordan in extraordinary numbers. The Golan Heights and Bashan region contain one of the highest concentrations of dolmens anywhere in the world. Over 5,000 examples have been documented. The largest dolmens in the region incorporate capstones weighing multiple tons, requiring either very large numbers of workers or very strong individuals to position. Who built them? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. The dolmens predate the Bronze Age populations attested in written records, and their builders have not been definitively identified through excavation. They are associated in local Arab tradition with the ancient giants of the region. Rujem el-Hiri, the large megalithic circle in the Golan, is sometimes called Wheel of the Giants in local tradition. The Hebrew Bible consistently associates the Rephaim with the Transjordan and Bashan. The dolmen builders are archaeologically anonymous. The two observations do not prove each other, but the geographical correspondence is real. The Rephaim Valley outside Jerusalem, the valley where the Philistines twice deployed against David in 2 Samuel 5, retains its name in modern Hebrew as Emek Rephaim. 3,000 years after the conquest, the valley still carries the name of the giant people, group associated with that territory in the biblical text. Place names are among the most durable records of ancient ethnic geography. The persistence of the name is not evidence of giant inhabitants, but it is evidence that the ancient population memory of the Rephaim was robust enough to name a geographical feature that still carries that name today. The Ugaritic Rephaim texts provide the most important external confirmation of the Nephilim tradition's ancient roots. Discovered at Ras Shamra, the same site that produced the Baal cycle and the rest of the Ugaritic mythological archive, these texts describe the Rephaim as a class of beings who dwell in the underworld. They are summoned in certain ritual contexts. They share meals with the gods. They carry epithets associated with extraordinary physical power and warrior status. They are explicitly different from ordinary dead humans. And they are associated with specific territories in the Transjordan, exactly the territories the Bible associates with the Rephaim as a living people group. The overlap is remarkable. The biblical Rephaim are a population of giant warriors in the Transjordan who are displaced or destroyed in the pre-conquest period. The Ugaritic Rephaim are powerful dead beings from the same geographical region who retain some form of existence in the underworld and can be called upon. The connection between the two, the living warrior people and the supernatural dead, suggests that whatever the Rephaim were, the ancient world understood them as a category of being that straddled the boundary between human and something greater. Their physical deaths did not fully resolve their existence. They persisted in some form on the other side. This is exactly the theological framework that 1 Enoch provides for the Nephilim. They die in the flood, or in the wars before the flood, but their spirits persist as disembodied beings. They are neither fully dead nor fully gone. The Ugaritic and biblical traditions independently arrive at a similar framework for the same population in the same geographical region. The archaeological case for the Nephilim tradition is not a case for suppressed giant skeletons. It is a case for a coherent ancient memory, confirmed in geography, confirmed in textual parallels, confirmed in the monumental landscape of Bashan, and consistent with what the oldest surviving texts about the Nephilim actually describe. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not just preserve the Book of Enoch. They contain additional texts that expand the Nephilim tradition in ways that most Bible readers have never encountered. Texts that were copied by the same community, in the same desert, at the same time, and treated with the same reverence as the biblical scrolls themselves. The Genesis Apocryphon, one of the 7 original scrolls from Cave 1, among the very first manuscripts discovered by Muhammad ed-Jib in 1947, is an Aramaic retelling and expansion of the Genesis narrative that contains extraordinary material. In its description of the birth of Noah, it preserves a passage that has no parallel in the canonical Genesis text. Noah's father Lamech returns home and finds his newborn son unusual in a way that alarms him. The child is described as luminous, his face radiant, his eyes brilliant with a light that fills the house. He is physically different from ordinary infants in ways the text describes but does not fully specify. Lamech is afraid. He goes to his wife Bitanosh and demands to know the truth. Have you truly conceived this child from me? Or is this one of the sons of heaven, of the Watchers, or one of the Nephilim? His wife assures him with oaths that the child is his. But Lamech is not satisfied. He goes to his father Methuselah. Methuselah, unable to answer, makes a long journey to find Enoch. And Enoch, who has already been translated to heaven, who stands in the divine presence and sees the future, confirms that the child is Noah's, that he will be righteous, and that he will be the one through whom humanity survives the coming flood. The significance of this passage is considerable and rarely appreciated. It means that in the pre-flood world, as described by this Dead Sea Scrolls text, the physical appearance of Watcher offspring was sufficiently distinctive and sufficiently recognizable that a father could look at his own newborn child and genuinely wonder whether a Watcher had fathered it. The Nephilim were not a vague theological abstraction. They were a physical reality present enough in the world that a devoted husband feared his wife had conceived a Nephilim child. The text does not treat this fear as paranoia. It treats it as a reasonable concern that required serious investigation at the highest available theological authority. The Book of Giants, a separate composition found in multiple fragments at Qumran, takes the tradition further into territory that the canonical text never enters. It describes the giant offspring of the Watchers from the inside. Their names, their deeds, their growing awareness that judgment is coming. The giants have prophetic dreams. Ohya, one of the giant sons of Shemihaza, dreams of a tree with 300 branches being felled by angels. His brother Maweh dreams of flooding water. The giants recognize the dreams as prophecies of their destruction. They decide to send Mahweh to find Enoch and request intercession. Mahweh flies to Enoch. Apparently, the giants have some capacity for extraordinary physical feats, and presents the giant's petition. Enoch's response is not compassion. He dictates a tablet of judgment. The giants will not be pardoned. Their fathers, the Watchers, violated a law that was not theirs to violate. The consequences are fixed. Let them prepare themselves. The Book of Giants was not only preserved at Qumran. Fragments of it were recovered from Manichaean manuscripts found in Central Asia at Turfan in Chinese Turkestan, in texts dating to the medieval period. The Manichaean religion, founded by the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, incorporated the Enoch tradition into its cosmology, including the giants, their destruction, and the ongoing presence of demonic spirits derived from their deaths. The same text about the giant offspring of the Watchers was read in 1st century Judea and 7th century Central Asia. That geographical and temporal span, across 2 continents and 1,000 years, speaks to the extraordinary durability of this tradition. Josephus, writing in Rome in the late 1st century CE for a Roman audience, largely unfamiliar with Jewish apocalyptic tradition, nonetheless mentions the physical remains of the giants explicitly. In his Jewish Antiquities, describing the Israelite encounter with the Anakim and the conquest of Hebron, he writes that the race of giants had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were astonishing to the sight and terrible in hearing, and that their bones were still being exhibited in his own time as curiosities unlike the bones of any known human population. Josephus is not writing for a credulous audience. He is writing for educated Romans who are skeptical of religious claims. His mention of exhibited giant bones, presented as current, verifiable physical evidence, reflects either genuine contemporary exhibition of unusual skeletal material or a tradition so robust that a careful historian felt comfortable citing it as fact. Either way, the Nephilim tradition was not merely textual in the 1st century. It had physical corollaries that people pointed to and examined. The Qumran community that preserved all of these texts, the community rule, the war scroll, the Book of Enoch, the Genesis Apocryphon, the Book of Giants, understood the Nephilim not as ancient mythology, but as the explanation for the current state of the world. The demonic spirits of the dead giants were present. They caused illness. They caused spiritual corruption. They were active. And the final victory over them was the event they were preparing for. The war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness that the war scroll described in military detail. For the Qumran community, the Nephilim question was not academic. It was the explanation for why the world was the way it was, and it would only be fully resolved at the end. The Nephilim create a theological problem that the biblical text never fully resolves, and that the later tradition addresses in multiple conflicting ways. Understanding that problem is what makes the Nephilim question genuinely significant, rather than simply a curiosity about ancient giants. The problem is this: if the sons of God, divine beings, members of the heavenly council, could cross the boundary between heaven and earth, take human women, and produce offspring that corrupted the entire world, then the cosmos is not as neatly ordered as the creation narrative of Genesis 1 implies. The boundary between the divine and human realms, between heaven and earth, can apparently be violated. The violation has catastrophic consequences, and the flood, which is supposed to resolve the corruption, doesn't fully resolve it, because the Nephilim appear again in Canaan after the flood, and the demonic spirits of the dead Nephilim continue to operate in the world indefinitely. Different ancient traditions resolve this problem in different ways, and the differences are theologically significant. The Enochic tradition, the tradition of one Enoch, the Genesis Apocryphon, and the Book of Giants, all from the Dead Sea Scrolls, resolves it by framing the Watcher's sin as a cosmic act of rebellion analogous to, but distinct from, the fall of Satan. The Watchers chose to violate a boundary they knew was sacred. They are judged. They are imprisoned until the final day. The flood destroyed their physical offspring. The demonic spirits of the dead Nephilim are a residual problem, real, dangerous, still active, but bounded within a framework of divine judgment that will eventually and definitively conclude. The world has a problem. The problem has a solution. The solution is deferred but certain. The Testament engages with the tradition in ways that are often missed, because the relevant passages are not explained to modern readers who lack the Second Temple background. The Epistle of Jude, the same letter that quotes 1 Enoch directly, addresses the angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling in verse 6, using language that is unmistakably drawn from the Watcher tradition. These beings are kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. This is not an abstract theological statement. It is a direct reference to the binding of the Watchers described in 1 Enoch, applied as a warning to people who similarly abandon their proper station. The second epistle of Peter in chapter 2 verse 4 uses nearly identical language. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to Tartarus, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. The Greek word used here, Tartaros, is the deepest part of the underworld in Greek cosmology, the prison of the Titans. A Jewish author writing in Greek, describing the imprisoned Watchers, reaches for the Greek word that most precisely captures what the Enochic tradition describes. A cosmic prison at the deepest level of the underworld, where rebellious divine beings are confined pending final judgment. The book of Revelation addresses the release of those imprisoned beings as a sign of the final days. When the fifth trumpet sounds in Revelation 9, the angel with the key to the abyss opens it. Smoke pours out. Beings emerge that are unlike any natural creature, composite, powerful, terrifying, led by a king named Abaddon in Hebrew and Apollyon in Greek. The language of imprisonment and release, the king of the abyss, the catastrophic effects of their emergence. All of this maps precisely onto the Enochic framework of the bound Watchers and their imprisoned offspring being released at the end of history. The theological arc is complete and coherent. The Watcher sin creates a cosmic problem in Genesis 6. The flood addresses the physical dimension of the problem, but not the spiritual dimension. The binding of the Watchers addresses the angelic dimension, but not the demonic one. The ongoing activity of Nephilim spirits, demons, is the explanation for spiritual evil in the world between the flood and the final judgment. And the release of the imprisoned beings at the end of days is the final escalation before the ultimate resolution. This is not a marginal tradition. It runs through 1 Enoch, through Jude, through 2 Peter, through Revelation. It was the framework through which the Qumran community understood their own era. It was the framework through which early Christianity understood spiritual warfare. And it begins, and will end, with the question that Genesis 6 raises and never fully answers within its own 4 verses. Who were the Nephilim? What did their existence mean? And what will it take to finally resolve what they started? Let's go back to Genesis 6:4. There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward. A very short sentence, but this tiny sentence is telling us something enormous. It's telling us that the flood was not the end of the story. It's telling us that whoever these Nephilim were, the waters did not completely wash them away. And the oldest texts that look at this question in depth, the book of Enoch, the Genesis Apocryphon, the book of Giants, all of which were found side by side with the Dead Sea Scrolls in those desert caves, they don't treat this as myth. They treat it as history. More than that, as cosmic history, as a real event that happened in a specific place, with specific beings, and whose consequences were still being felt in the world of the people who wrote those texts. Here's the real issue. You can read these texts literally, or you can read them symbolically. The conclusion doesn't change, because the written evidence we have is genuinely remarkable. The community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the community closest in time to when these texts were written, took the Nephilim tradition very seriously. Very, very seriously. For them, this account was one of the central frameworks for understanding why the world is the way it is, why evil keeps coming back, and why the spiritual world is so dangerous. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The giants are gone. Even if they really did exist physically the way the tradition describes, the flood and later the conquest of Canaan wiped them out as a biological population. Fine. But what about the theological problem they represent? The crossing of the line between the divine and the human. The corruption introduced into the created order. The lingering influence of disembodied spirits in this world. Has any of that been resolved? No, it hasn't. The biblical tradition is actually very clear on this point. That reckoning was postponed to the final judgment. When you stop and think about it logically, something big is happening here. The Nephilim question is not only a question about ancient history. It is not just what happened thousands of years ago. It is also a question about something that is still in this world, and something that is still coming. In the end, human nature sometimes doesn't even know its own limits, especially when the line between the divine and the human is involved. Maybe once you cross that line, there is no going back. Maybe the price keeps being paid even thousands of years later. So what do you think the Nephilim really were? Physical giants? Spiritual beings? Or something the ancient world was trying to describe, but could never fully put into words? And do you think the Watcher's tradition is telling us something real about the nature of the evil that is still active in the world today? Leave your answer in the comments. I'll read them and I'll try to write back. Finally, don't forget to subscribe for the new documentaries. We'll keep going after the things humanity has chosen to forget. See you in the next one.